Hello, everybody. I am Jason Edward Lewis, and I'm going to talk about the idea of the future imaginary for the next few minutes. So, in the way that I think about it, the future imaginary is composed of a couple things. It's a vision of the future shared by a group of people and used to motivate change in the present. It provides communities with a shared vocabulary for discussing the future and strategies for getting to the future they desire. And it centrally incorporates capacity building within the community so the community can take control of how such futures get built. Uh, but it's also a set of strategies for creating worlds of our choosing. So it provides us, so future imaginaries provide us with ways to revise our sense of what is possible, so we can get out of the assumptions of what are the facts of our social and political worlds and really think freely about other ways of being otherwise. We can ask our own questions. So the work that I do is largely with Indigenous communities. We often are in a position where people are asking questions for us. This particularly comes, from academics, a long history of research being done on Indigenous people and sort of solutions generated for Indigenous people without actually asking us what we want to have answered and what we want to have explored. It's about asserting our presence in the future. So again, Indigenous people, if you look at, one of the main ways we have in our current contemporary culture for imagining the future, which is through science fiction, particularly in film and video games, there are often very few Indigenous people, if any. There are very few brown people. This is slowly changing, but certainly we've grown up with many generations now of futures that have been imagined where there are no Indigenous people, there are no brown people. And I would argue that that is the dominant Western future imaginary, is the imaginary future imaginary of Star Wars, right? Where it's like you look around, you're like, wow, this is kind of funny, all these different planets, and most of these people are white. Uh, we get to romance our sovereignty. And the idea here is that we can imagine being self-determined again. We can imagine having control over our lives as individuals, but as community members, as people working together to create the kinds of communities that we want. And it's really necessary to imagine that, because that's not where we are in some sense now. Certainly, the Indigenous people, that communities I'm working with, are still very much living within a colonial framework that controls many aspects of our lives. So the kind of the romance part of it is that we need to kind of just let go and sort of kind of let the practicalities and the challenges and the heartbreaks of living within under that situation of control. We need to let it go and really kind of think freely about what it might be like if we could really determine what is happening with our communities. And of course, we need to practice futures together. The idea there is that this is a way for us to talk with each other and establish common visions, and then sort of practice those together, sort of inhabit these future imaginaries, so that we can get a sense of not what it's like just as individuals, but what it might be like as groups of people, as communities, as nations, in that future that we're imagining. So this is just a really quick taste of some of the future imaginaries that we have helped support over the last 15 years. And by we, I mean Aboriginal Territories in Cyberspace and the Initiative for Indigenous Futures. So on the upper left there's Jesse Tunglik, who is Inuit, and he imagines a spaceship. He's sort of imagining what it might be like to be Inuit going out into space. And so he's imagining a spacesuit, not a spaceship. He's imagining a spacesuit made out of seal skin, because of course seals are very central to Inuit culture. And so thinking about how to bring that thing that's really central to his culture into a future frame, into space, into thinking and dreaming about being an Inuit astronaut. On the upper right, this is Blueberry Pie Under a Martian Sky by Scott Benison-Abandan, where he, who is Anishinaabe, and he used virtual VR installation to imagine what it might be like for a young Anishinaabe boy to return to the Seven Sisters, to return to the origin place of Anishinaabe using wormhole technology. Bottom right is Kale Malika'a Collective, which is the group of students that were in our first Skins workshop on Aboriginal storytelling and video games in Honolulu, which took place in the summer of 2017. And part of what they did is they were imagining Kanaka in space. So what might it mean to bring, for instance, Kanaka Maoli or Hawaiian astrogation techniques, so techniques for navigating across vast distances using the stars in part, out into actual outer space. And use that to navigate between planets and solar systems and stars. And then on the lower left is the Peacemaker Returns, which is, so sorry, the Hawaiian piece was a video game, and then Skawanati's piece is a machinima, so a movie made in virtual environments. And so it's called The Peacemaker Returns. And so she's imagining taking the teachings of a person who was very central to the coming together of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy or Iroquois Confederacy, of which the Mohawks are part, and Skawanati is Mohawk. And so the Peacemaker brought the different nations together into the Confederacy using a philosophy of government, basically, called the Great Law of Peace. And so she imagines sort of both that event, and then she imagines a new peacemaker for our contemporary situation, bringing together all of the nations of this planet. And then she imagines a future situation where yet another peacemaker brings together 5 different intergalactic species in order to make peace. So I'm going to talk specifically about future imaginaries for Indigenous AI. For me, this is, I think, a really great example of how future imaginaries can work. So we conducted a series of workshops called the Indigenous Protocol and Artificial Intelligence Workshops, which had as their core question, from an Indigenous perspective, what should our relationship with artificial intelligence be? And so this was a really amazing kind of sustained exercise in creating future imaginaries. So bringing together a number of Indigenous folks and a couple non-Indigenous folks from all over North America, the Pacific, Aotearoa, and Australia, brought them to Honolulu to spend 3 days talking with each other about this question and imagining what kind of futures working with this technology we wanted to have for our communities. And, you know, future imaginaries don't have to be all sort of sci-fi-like. They don't have to be fantastical, right? They can be very mundane in some ways. And in fact, that's one of the reasons why I use the term future imaginary as opposed to Indigenous futurism for the sort of work that I do, is that I'm interested in both the kind of really kind of crazy and out there and fantastical, but also the mundane sort of day-to-day of how people might live in the future, right? So what might it be like, you know, to walk out my door and see all the street signs in Alalo, Hawaii, right? In Hawaiian language, right? That's a future imaginary that doesn't exist. It certainly doesn't exist where I live in Montreal. It would be Mohawk here instead. You know, but it doesn't exist. It exists to some extent in Hawaii, but it's not sort of blanket and it's not comprehensive. So imagining that kind of world is a future imaginary. So out of the workshops, we produced the Indigenous Protocol and Artificial Intelligence position paper. So it's a pretty substantial document that I really encourage everybody to go take a look at. There's sort of something for everybody. There's academic journal articles. There's poetry, there's short stories, there's descriptions of technology prototype development. So there's a really wide range of approaches to answering that question of, what might AI created from an Indigenous perspective, what might it look like? So this is part of my contribution. I contributed a poem series that was built around this idea of a young Hawaiian person being raised alongside three different AIs. So one of the AIs would be based on Hawaiian concepts of caring for the land, of responsibility to the land and everything on it, and then also your kinship networks. Another AI would be based on sort of inspired by Leroy Little Bear, talking about the Blackfoot language being a process or flow-oriented language. And so having an AI that sees the world as a collection of energy flows as opposed to a series of objects to be manipulated. And then a third AI that was based on the sort of neural architecture of the octopus with its highly distributed neural system that allows the 8 arms to sort of autonomously process things on their own with very little intervention from the central cluster of nerves. So I'm thinking about what it might be like to have to have an AI that had that kind of processing power. And so this allows me personally to think about, okay, what kind of future do I want to have with AI personally as a Hawaiian person, and also sort of in Hawaii. Part of the future imaginary is, to go back to my language example, we're translating the entire position paper into Hawaiian, because that's part of that imagination as well, right? So imagine a future where all the learning materials that we have for the technologies that we use are in the language of your community, so that you don't constantly have to kind of go outside that language to learn about technical things. And also we can take care, like we did in this translation, to really sort of find the right way of describing these technologies within the cultural framework of the communities that we're working with, right? And this is really fun. You sort of need to think up of new words because they don't necessarily already exist in the language. You need to think about what is it that already exists in the language and the way that we are seeing the world that allows us to understand something like artificial intelligence. And that actually, because of all that, how we understand artificial intelligence might be different from, say, the Western dominant framework for understanding artificial intelligence. And then there's I just want to talk quickly about the Alalo Programming Collective, which sort of did work for a couple of years, and they've kind of gone quiet now. We help support them. They in part came out of that Skins video game workshop that I was talking about earlier in Honolulu. But this was a group of young Hawaiians who were looking at how to create a Hawaiian language version of C# for use in the Unity programming environment, because they were using Unity to create video games in virtual environments. But they wanted to be able to do that using the language directly instead of having to always resort to English. And also, they're very interested in developing sort of methodologies and developing a language version and methodologies so that this Hawaiian language version of C# could be the one that's used to teach young people who are in Hawaiian immersion schools. So schools in Hawaii where the majority of instruction is in the language, is in Hawaiian. Because again, there's that challenge there, is that a lot of times for things like science and technology, in order to do the instruction in those subjects, they have to break out of the context of their language, right? And go into English in order to learn those things. And so what does it mean, again, to learn science and technology within your own language. And I think that's it for me today. And I hope you're enjoying the workshop. Thank you.